Good morning from Washington, D.C. My name is Lauren Reese, and on behalf of my colleagues at the Wilson Center and our co-sponsor for this event, the Center for Climate and Security, it's my privilege to welcome you to today's discussion on climate security with leaders from across the U.S. government. For those of you joining a Wilson Center event for the first time, a special welcome and a quick word about where you're tuning into. The Wilson Center is the living memorial to President Wilson. We were mandated by Congress to bridge the worlds of policy, practice, and research through nonpartisan, independent analysis and open dialogue. Our programs span every region of the world and today's most pressing issues, and we're lucky to have a number of those programs co-sponsoring today's event. The program I direct, the Environmental Change and Security Program, has for nearly 3 decades provided a space for policymakers and practitioners from the development, diplomacy, and defense arenas to better understand how the intersection of environment, population, health, and security issues connects to foreign policy and development. Our goal is to provide analysis at an intersection of issues that most institutions, government agencies, and offices are not set up to deal with. And I'll say that promisingly, the nature of our work has changed over the last decade in particular, as there has been a growing awareness of the need for more interdisciplinary, integrated approaches to development and security. The topic of today's discussion, the recent release of a suite of climate security products by the administration, and who we're going to hear from on today's panel, really speaks to that progress. Climate change is certainly pushing the boundaries of how we understand risk, what constitutes security, and where the solutions lie. And we'll hear more about that from Aaron Sikorsky in just a few minutes. But while climate insecurity poses real risks, there's also a real opportunity to get the response right through US leadership and partnership with the international community, civil society, NGOs, and multilateral organizations. So I want to thank our panelists for being with us today, and I want to thank our friends at the Center for Climate and Security for their partnership on today's event. Before we get to the panel, we're going to hear from 2 important leaders in this space. For over a decade, Sherry Goodman has been laying the groundwork for how the security and intelligence communities can better understand climate's impact on stability. But even before she was talking climate security, she was charting new territory at the Defense Department as the first Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Environmental Security. Today, Sherry is a Senior Fellow at the Wilson Center and a Senior Strategist at the Center for Climate and Security. Following Sherry, we'll hear from Aaron Sikorsky, who directs the Center for Climate and Security and brings a host of expertise to that position from her previous role as Deputy Director of the Strategic Futures Group on the National Intelligence Council, where she co-authored the Global Trends Report and led the U.S. intelligence community's environmental and climate security analysis. Sherry, over to you.
Thank you so much, Lauren. And it's really a pleasure to be here with everyone today, and a tribute to Lauren and her leadership at the Environmental Change and Security Program, which has really strengthened the longstanding program at the Wilson Center and really integrated across so many communities. So my hat's off to you, Lauren, for your excellent work. And it's really just a pleasure to be here with everyone. I think we've reached really a high water mark here now on climate ambition across and action among the security communities. And that's what we're here today to talk about. And it really marks a landmark in sort of convergence and integration across in many ways. So I'm going to just describe a few of them because one, we are collaborating across think tanks. I wear a hat both at the Wilson Center with Lauren and at the Center for Climate and Security with Aaron Sikorsky and our other colleagues there. And and the Center for Climate and Security has been at the very heart of climate security leadership and action for over a decade now. And the Wilson Center itself has been in this game now for several decades, really since its founding. And the 2 organizations work extremely well together. And I'd say that's also a theme going on here among all the participants and organizations represented today. I should say it's probably no accident that they're all women, which is something I should say over 30 years ago when I served as the first female professional staff member on the Senate Armed Services Committee, one could not have imagined that we would be here today. So this for me is really personally very, very rewarding and touching. So let me also talk a little bit about the history of climate security within the United States in the context now that we're at the end of the COP26 with so many commitments having been made, so many more demanded of, and so much expectation around the world to fight climate change and transition our energy systems. So in the back in the 1997 Kyoto Protocol negotiations, when I served as the Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Environmental Security, I sent 2 uniformed officers on that delegation, a Navy captain and an Air Force colonel. And so that's just to say that already going back to that time now, quarter century ago, the Department of Defense was involved with addressing climate action in that era. And they were very welcomed with open arms as part of that delegation, because as any of you know who work with our military, they can do everything from negotiate the fine points of a very complex agreement to bring coffee to weary participants in the middle of the night. So that marked the beginning of the national security communities in many ways beginning to understand climate security as it applied to their missions. Now, fast forward into the mid-2000s when I founded the CNA Military Advisory Board, which in 2007, the first group of generals and admirals to address the national security implications of climate change, we characterized climate change as a threat multiplier. And that led Congress to enact on the defense authorization bills and then into other legislation as well, the requirement to address the national security implications of climate change in the National Defense Strategy, the National Military Strategy, the Quadrennial Defense Review, and the President's National Security Strategy, as well as the very first National Intelligence assessment at that time of climate security. That's going back now almost 15 years. That work helped advance understanding within the national security communities. And I include here our partners at USAID and state very much in that, have been in it all along since the beginning. And so now we've moved into an era where we have sort of the 3 Ds in some ways all represented here. I'd say, diplomacy, even though we don't have State Department, I'm going to let Jen, our terrific leader, Jen DeCicero, who has kind of covered all the waterfront and at the White House really brings everything together, represent that sort of integration here. And then we have, of course, defense and USAID represented today. And for those of you who may not spend a lot of time with the Defense Department in particular, I want to make a special note that it's not always been the case that the Office of the Secretary of Defense and the Joint Staff are sitting together hand in hand, arm in arm on a matter of important defense policy. And I think that is very important to note here, that there is seems to be a very good partnership between OSD and the Joint Staff. So I give a lot of credit to our speakers, Kim and Reba, Brigadier General Sunkist, and your leadership for working so closely on these important issues. I think that's highly important. So we've got an integrated whole of government 3D approach. We've got great documents that have been reports that have been released in recent months that we're going to talk about that were directed by President Biden's executive order from very early in his presidency. And those reports have come out recently, led by the team you see here, both on the defense climate risk analysis and the first intelligence community climate national intelligence estimate, both of which I was privileged to be a reviewer and advisor on. And I think they represent a clear advancement in thinking and understanding and action that can lead to requirements in those agencies. And now we also have a USAID strategy out for comment on climate security and a climate migration document. So we've got a whole suite of documents that are really leading forward in this. So I want to thank both all the panelists who are here today, your leaders in your own right in very important ways. And I know many of you participating are very active in this community too. So I want to thank you because we have created a very strong community of practice here and a whole generation of climate security leaders, of which I'm very proud to be a part. So thank you to all. And now I'm going to turn the scene setting portion of this discussion over to my colleague, Erin Sikorsky, who is a great leader. We're so fortunate at the Center for Climate Security to have her after her distinguished tenure at the National Intelligence Council. Over to you, Erin.
Great. Thank you so much, Sherry. Thanks, Lauren. Thanks to the Wilson Center for co-hosting. For those of you who don't know, the Center for Climate and Security is a nonpartisan institute focused on the nexus of climate change and national security. We facilitate policy development processes and dialogues. We conduct research. We communicate to the public as we are today and act as a resource hub in the climate and security field. I also, of course, want to offer thanks to our participants from the US government to discuss these reports today. We really have an all-star lineup, and as Sherry said, it's great to see an all-female lineup as well. But before you hear from them, I'm just going to take a few minutes to provide a high-level summary of the risk analysis in the reports that Lauren and Sherry mentioned to set the scene for today's discussion. However, I also encourage you all to dig into them yourself. They're all very readable, full to the brim with excellent analysis, exactly the kind of work that we at the Center for Climate and Security recommended in our Climate Security Plan for America in 2019. And I really commend the administration for its efforts thus far to put climate change at the center of its foreign and security policy. As I read through the documents again this week in preparation for this event, a handful of overarching themes stood out to me that I want to highlight here. There are four. So the first is that climate change is forcing the US national security community to re-examine its assumptions about how the world works. No longer are past understandings of the climate a good predictor of the future. As the Defense Climate Risk Analysis noted, quote, analysis based on historical frameworks will not be sufficient to prepare for future risks complicated by a changing climate. Whether it's extreme weather, rising temperatures, the energy transition, these are just some of the factors that are upending core planning assumptions, from strategic level understandings of other countries' key interests to more tactical level understandings of where and when insurgent groups will likely fight. Climate change is reshaping the security landscape, forming a new backdrop, and creating new threats. At the beginning of the Department of Homeland Security Strategic Framework, one of the suite of documents released last month, the Secretary notes that the threats posed by climate change to the homeland deserve as much attention as terrorism, cyber threats, and the COVID-19 pandemic. The second key theme is that climate security is a now problem and a future problem. Spin a globe, put your finger down, and you can tell a story about a climate security challenge already underway in that part of the world. Again, looking to the DHS strategic framework, its plan was designed, it says, in part to tackle the department's duty to safeguard the homeland from today's increasingly severe, frequent, and destructive climate change-related emergencies. And similarly, the DoD report noted that many effects to the physical environment are now unavoidable and will continue to shape our security environment. Hence, adaptation and resilience measures are critical to the climate security response, to be able to tackle existing challenges and those baked in over the next few decades, even if all emissions were cut tomorrow. However, all of the documents, the analysis, and all of them makes clear that adaptation and resilience are only going to get you so far. They're only a piece of the puzzle. Each report details how the security challenges associated with climate change will worsen in decades to come if emissions are not cut. The National Intelligence Estimate from the DNI outlines differentiated security impacts at both 1.5 degrees warming and 2 degrees warming. It also notes that there will be increasing pressure on governments to act as temperatures rise. And you just have to look at what's been happening in Scotland over the past couple of weeks to see that. The report states, quote, geopolitical tensions are likely to grow as countries increasingly argue about how to accelerate the reductions in net greenhouse gas emissions needed to meet Paris Agreement goals. And our own analysis at CCS has shown that if the world remains on a high warming trajectory, the security implications in the second half of the century are catastrophic. So we have to build adaptation and resilience. We also have to mitigate and cut emissions. The third theme throughout the reports is that climate security risks are wide-ranging and not confined to particular geographies or sectors. In other words, no region of the world will be untouched by climate security crises. Some regions may have more resources and tools available to manage the shocks to the system, but no country will escape the shocks. The National Intelligence Estimate identified 11 different countries facing high levels of insecurity due to climate hazards. Some are in the United States' backyard, Guatemala, Honduras, Nicaragua. Some are armed with nuclear weapons, Pakistan, India, North Korea. The report also names 2 regional arcs of vulnerability, Central Africa and the Pacific Island states. Perhaps even more interesting, though, is what the NIE says about risks to the United States and other wealthy countries. And I actually think it's worth reading the extended quote directly because it's powerful and frames the scope of the risk we're facing. Quote, "The United States and others are in a relatively better position to deal with the major costs and dislocations of forecasted change, in part because they have greater resources to adapt, but will nonetheless require difficult adjustments. Climate impacts such as excessive heat, flooding, and extreme storms will prove increasingly costly, require military shifts, and increase demands for humanitarian assistance and disaster relief operations. Adjusting to such changes will often be wrenching, and populations will feel negative effects in their daily lives that will become more difficult to reverse. The impacts will be massive, even if the worst human costs can be avoided." And again, here, I think you just have to look at the events of this past summer in the United States, in Canada, in Germany, in Europe. I mean, and you can see exactly what the NIE is talking about. The fourth and final theme to highlight is that climate security cannot be separated from other major security concerns for the United States. And in fact, it shapes and exacerbates those other concerns. Each of the reports emphasizes the interconnections between climate change and other security factors and the subsequent second-order risks that can emerge. The migration report, which came from the White House, puts it very clearly, noting, "When combined with physical, social, economic, and/or environmental vulnerabilities, climate change can undermine food, water, and economic security. Secondary effects of climate change can include displacement, loss of livelihoods, weakened governments, and in some cases, political instability and conflict." And of course, when talking about major security concerns to the United States, there is nothing more major now than the competition with China. And I would argue both the defense analysis and the NIE do an excellent job underscoring the need for bringing a climate lens to our security policy regarding China. For its part, the defense report acknowledges that the behavior of US competitors and adversaries will be altered by climate change, giving an example in the Indo-Pacific, where China may try to take advantage of climate change to gain influence. The same report also indicates that US allies, partners, and competitors are assessing the implications of climate change on their strategic objectives, the implication being that we in the United States must do the same to not be caught flat-footed. The NIE also identifies areas in which Chinese behavior is exacerbating climate risks and where China is trying to gain advantage and access to critical minerals or economic power for the energy transition. And all of that must be integrated into our security analysis as well. So pulling these 4 observations together, I would argue they underscore the following as we look towards next steps. First, that there's no time to waste. The risks are already here and growing. Second, that a whole of government approach is critical, as we're seeing on the call today. But while each agency has slightly different needs, the risks overlap and there are lots of synergies to be had. And third, that to sustain transformational change in the long run and make sure that the climate is integrated going forward, the approach must be mainstreamed, not siloed. And we need to not only have climate change and climate security dealt with in the climate office, but across all of the agencies and the regional bureaus. And I know from our conversations and the rest of the reports that the folks on today's panel have many ideas and plans for just how to do this. And I really look forward to hearing from all of them in the panel discussion. And thanks again for being here. I really can't wait to hear what you all have to say.
Thank you, Sherry and Aaron. Aaron, when you said you'd provide a 10-minute overview of the key takeaways from the climate security products, I wasn't sure it could be done, but that was really an excellent highlight reel. So thank you for doing that. Now it's my privilege to introduce our panel. Brigadier General Rebecca Sonkis is the Deputy Director for Counter Threats and International Cooperation on the Joint Staff. She advises the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff on all global and functional matters pertaining to stability and humanitarian engagement, security cooperation activities, the chairman's mission to the United Nations, countering weapons of mass destruction, countering violent extremist organizations, Arctic and maritime operations. She's also a command pilot with more than 4,400 hours, including over 1,300 combat hours. Among other assignments, she commanded the 15th Airlift Squadron through 2 deployments and was the vice commander of the 455th Air Expeditionary Wing at Bagram Airfield in Afghanistan. Kim Cruzy serves as Chief of Climate and Arctic Policy in the Office of the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy. She has previously served as Director of Cooperative Threat Reduction Policy, Chief of Staff for Europe and NATO Policy, and the Country Director for Spain, Portugal, and Turkey. Kim also covered East and Southeast Asia counter-narcotics policy, and served as a Colombia political military analyst. Jennifer DeCicero is the Director for Climate Security and Resilience in the National Security Council's Climate and Energy Directorate. She works at the intersection of climate change and national security with a focus on how the accelerating effects of climate change impact the institutional, economic, and social resilience of society. Jennifer comes to the NSC from the Department of Energy, where she served as the Director for Recovery and Critical Energy Infrastructure and led the department's long-term energy sector disaster recovery efforts. Teresa McGee is a member of the Senior Foreign Service and currently the Deputy Assistant Administrator for USAID's Bureau for Conflict Prevention and Stabilization. Prior to her current position, she served as the Mission Director for USAID in Burma, South Sudan, and Angola, and Deputy Mission Director in Mozambique. Over the course of her career, she has worked in 17 countries in Africa and Asia. Clearly, the range of expertise and experience on this panel is truly remarkable. So let's get to the conversation. If you have a question, you're able to put them into the chat box below the video stream that you should be watching right now. I want to start by inviting each of you to share what the administration's push to articulate the interconnected nature of climate and security risks means for your agency. How are you thinking and working on these issues? The release of the climate security analyses certainly signals a leaning in on this issue, but what's different now? And how is it being institutionalized so that it can sustain in the long run? Jennifer, why don't we start with you?
Thanks, Lauren. I would just start by saying, obviously, I'm not at an agency currently, but getting to work across the entire interagency on these issues has been pretty eye-opening over the last several months. We led the development of the report looking at the impacts of climate change on migration from here at the NSC. And I would say through that experience, we brought together departments and agencies from across the entire government, all of our federal science agencies, as we call the 3Ds, the agencies looking at defense, diplomacy, and development, and really, got to work together and think together, I think, in a way that we probably haven't done previously. The work on climate had been pretty limited over the last several years, but prior to that, climate was really, as I think Erin mentioned in her opening remarks, kind of siloed off, right? We've talked about climate, but we talked about climate in its own topic area. And we didn't talk about how climate is actually impacting a lot of other areas that we are focusing on. And so what I would say is that, the push by the administration to really look at how climate is actually exacerbating our security risks is something new. And it is really, we like to talk about it here, we're creating new muscle memory for how we actually integrate climate into the work that we're doing across the interagency. And rather than having it be in a silo, we're now looking at things through a climate lens. I mean, Erin also talked about how climate is upending our core planning assumptions, right? So it's really not about looking at climate by itself, but looking at, yes, there are security risks, but in climate vulnerable countries, those security risks are increasing because of the impacts from climate change. And so I think we're just thinking in a different way and approaching our work in a different way than we have historically.
Thank you, Jennifer. Reba and Kim, what about for the Joint Staff and DoD?
Sure, thank you very much. This has been a really great introduction And the words that came through with the introductions in terms of integration, convergence, collaboration on climate captures how we in policy are taking the climate lens to make sure it's integrated across all our strategic and policy documents. And that is important because it's going to impact how we look at the missions that we need to do, how it impacts readiness, and the costs that come with that. So these are all considerations that within policy, we're working closely with our regional desks and other functional desks, with stabilization office, as we look at security cooperation. So all of these threads are being pulled through. I want to recognize that the DCRA was a first for us strategically, but it also complements what our colleagues in ANS have been doing in their climate adaptation report that came out. So there's a lot of dovetailing happening throughout the department. And I have to give a nod to, of course, the engines of action. And that is what the Joint Staff has always been looking at as it relates to what it means for our warriors, the war fighters.
Yeah, thanks, Kim. And you know, you do frame that really well. The Joint Staff, we do approach the universe really from the warfighting perspective, and then providing advice to our OSD counterparts as they formulate policy and then what we choose to buy in the end. So, you know, if you talk about investments in resiliency that allow us to provide warfighting capability, that more importantly, when you build up a resilient environment, it doesn't require other resources to go respond to, because that particular area is able to work through a particular event. You know, I think that's what we have always done in kind of assessing the battlefield environment, if you will, with respect to the climate, is something that we always have done. What is significantly different is the level of acceleration with this problem set. And so some of the frameworks that we use for, you know, the longer term view on things and how we change our bureaucracy and change DoD over the long term are accelerated in that space. And so knowing that you can't just kind of sit back and hope we work through this in a timely way, we need to drive change so that in the future we are prepared to support and defend the Constitution of the United States, that your force is ready to do that, right? That we're able to operate in whatever environment we're required to operate in, that we're able to provide response to those humanitarian crises that emerge because of the accelerant that is global at this point. And more importantly, what I love about the whole of government approach that we're taking now is how do we get left of that, which is where we all really want to be, in areas that we know are particularly at risk. Are there investment strategies that we can take to help them be more resilient that then precludes the conflict and the requirement for us to respond in mass? And that's the really great work that I see happening that to me gets me excited. You know, at my core, I'm a air mobility command person, so I've done my fair share of response to various crises across the globe. That puts a demand on our joint force when we do that. It affects readiness. It affects our ability to project combat power because we've now had to use it for a different requirement. It's not to say that that requirement is a bad requirement, but if we can reduce that because we are looking at that left of that conflict, that particular problem set, then I think in the end, we're a stronger joint force. So I'm excited about this portfolio. I think we've done some really great work in framing documents, and it'll be really awesome over the next couple of years to watch us build that out in a way that makes us more ready. So thanks again, Kim, and back to you.
Thank you, Reba. And you set it up nicely to hand it over to Teresa and thinking about the investments that we can make at the outset, right, to sort of head off some of the risks. Teresa, Sherry had mentioned that USAID's climate strategy is out for review right now. We were lucky to have Gillian Caldwell, the agency's climate change coordinator, on a panel with Jennifer last month, and she noted the potential for proactive, intentional climate responses to support peace building efforts. Can you talk a little bit about what this has, this leaning in by the administration on climate security has meant for USAID?
Sure. Thank you, Lauren, and thank you to the Wilson Center for hosting this conversation today. You know, every time I am at the table or in a room with or in a virtual room with my interagency colleagues, I learn so much from them, and I also get ideas about how we can collaborate. And I think that I really want to commend the Defense and Intelligence agencies for releasing these studies publicly, giving us talking points that we can also share publicly, and so that we can all learn how much climate is critical to our national security. And for USAID, that sort of manifests itself in it as we look at it as a human security issue. You know, as you mentioned during the COP, Samantha Power talked about USAID being a climate agency, and that we're putting a climate lens on everything we do. We are a whole of climate agency. And I did want to give a plug for our climate strategy, as Lauren mentioned, that is out for public review until November 24th. And we'll try to get a link to all of you. We're really particularly interested in getting comments from the peace building community and from the security community on our USAID climate strategy. So we'll make sure that that link is available on the Wilson Center website so people can all access it easily. For USAID, one of the things, we have a couple of, we're a little bit different in the way that we approach climate, or because we can integrate it into a lot of different sectors. So not only, we sort of see both climate and conflict as part of the context, and they're very connected to each other, because certainly as nations feel the effect of climate change, there are conditions that are going to increase the risk of conflict. And we want to always be out in front of that and be able to identify early warning signs of potential conflict. Also, countries that are currently experiencing conflict or violence, whether it be in the form of violent extremism, intercommunal conflict, all of the different sort of risks that countries undergo even without climate, those countries are in a lesser position to actually address what we need to address with climate change too. The governance in those countries may not be strong enough to actually implement important changes that have to happen. So we need to engage both, sort of on the risk and on the solution end of that. We have expertise, we have a footprint, and we have a mandate. I noticed, like in the NIE, almost every country that it identifies as at risk or highly vulnerable are places where USAID actually has a presence, and we're already working on some of these issues. Within our CPS Bureau, we have staff that are now dedicated to the intersection of conflict and climate. We have what we call a conflict integrator that actually helps us to integrate conflict conscious programming in all of the sectors where USAID works. And since we work across several sectors, we're able to look at both climate conscious and conflict conscious approaches in our agriculture programs, our water programs, our economic growth, livelihoods, governance, civil society strengthening, and our education programming. And we can build into those programs a requirement that activities take equity into account as well, and to not put undue burden from like climate mitigation measures or adaptation on marginalized populations. Ultimately, that can be a driver of conflict. So we want to be careful of that. And then the last point I just want to make is that as part of our climate strategy, USAID has just announced some really ambitious targets. And so it's critical that we take a leadership role in advancing ambitious climate policy around the world. Some of the targets in our strategy is preventing 6 billion tons of greenhouse gas emissions, conserving 100 million hectares of critical landscapes, and mobilizing $150 billion in climate finance. So, so you can see that there are goals that feel ambitious to us. I think others say we need to be more ambitious, because I think the urgency of addressing climate change has really come to the forefront with this COP. And I'm proud to be part of an administration that really takes it seriously and really wants to address it aggressively. And that interagency coordination is going to be all important. Thank you.
Thanks, Teresa. You made a couple really good points that I want to come back to, but first I thought we might think, I think it was Reba, who mentioned the regional offices and coordination, take a minute to talk about the impacts of this new approach or emerging approach beyond the offices in DC, right? And if you can share some of the notable shifts in perspective, in policies, or in operations that are going to impact field offices, whether it's combatant commands, missions, embassies. So how do you see these strategies and analyses and efforts sort of percolating across US outreach across the globe? If anybody wants to jump in, I'll let you. Otherwise, I will probably go back to Jennifer first.
Thanks, Lauren. I can start. And I would say, we've got the DoD climate risk analysis, and I'm not going to speak to that. I will leave DoD and Joint Staff colleagues to talk about that. But I'd like to talk a little bit about how we're looking at this in practice. Earlier in the summer, late spring, early summer, the administration released the strategy looking at the root causes of migration to our southern border. And, it looked at multiple components that are driving migration from Central American countries. And, a primary driver isn't necessarily climate, but when we look at this in practice, we are seeing the impacts of climate change that are kind of contributing to people moving, both internally and then potentially moving to out-migration. And so looking at, from that perspective, we're working very closely. I should step back and say climate is acknowledged in the root causes strategy as a contributor to migration. And so in looking at how that gets addressed, we are working really closely with colleagues from USAID, State Department, and others. And so, in this work, as the missions, the USAID missions are planning future programming, as the embassies are engaged, looking at how climate is actually integrated into that planning. So, a number of countries are still recovering from the two major hurricanes that hit last summer. There were impacts to agricultural production, significant impacts to built environment, where kind of whole villages, whole communities were completely destroyed. And so really looking at how climate does get integrated as we're doing, recovery work, how for countries or communities that are very dependent on agriculture or livelihoods, how you actually can support those communities in making the agriculture kind of more climate resilient, how you make your built environment more climate resilient, et cetera. So as we are making investments and developing programs, doing so in a way that really does take into account those very community-specific climate risks that they are facing. So I would just say that that's kind of one aspect of how we are in practice actually integrating this into kind of work within the missions and embassies, et cetera.
Thanks, Jennifer. Pentagon friends, what about combatant commands and sort of security cooperation? Can you speak to how you're seeing the new strategies being implemented outside of DC?
I think I'll first talk about how in policy we're taking kind of the primacy of what the DCRA has done and how climate is really a geostrategic issue and the implications that climate change has on risks for the homeland, across the globe, and what it means with our relationships with partners and allies. So with that, we're working closely with our regional offices, with each desk, because in Europe NATO context, we're talking with those allies that are also looking at this. We're also speaking with colleagues in the East Asia and the Africa policy offices, because they're engaging with counterparts and understanding and learning from them how climate is impacting those countries and their risks and missions there. We're also looking at how to capitalize on policy levers like the DoD regional centers, because that's another engagement tool on the academic side and on the science side of working with allies and partners. So with those tools, it's getting cooked into our bilateral discussions, our multilateral discussions, but it also means we're working closely with our joint staff counterparts that also have bilateral interactions with their counterparts.
Sure, thanks, Kim, for that. I alluded to this earlier, but climate change, it is an increasingly destabilizing force and accelerating destabilization force, and it's impacting our operational environment. It's creating new missions, and our allies and partners are going to be called to respond to these increased demands, particularly for humanitarian assistance. We talked about that earlier. When climate hazards converge and compound, there are likely going to be unprecedented challenges for governments, including the United States, as well as our allies and partners. And we have to be ready to work with them in responding to these missions, which means we need to train and exercise together in advance of the need to respond. And I think, on the security cooperation front, as you were talking about, that is a big space that we're playing in. And it's building that resiliency in advance that we talked about earlier. And also, those relationships at the combatant commands where they have a dialogue with allies and partners about what they need in order to be more resilient and able to respond on their own and not necessarily require that demand from the United States to respond is a pretty big space. Our combatant commands, I think, are best leveraged to have those partnerships to be able to, really, what do you need? And actually listen and then help build out our strategies from there. Thanks.
Thank you, Reba and Kim. Teresa, this sort of building on this question and tying in a point that you made about sort of equity and working with partners on the ground, and the fact that USAID has a huge footprint in a lot of the countries that are sort of fragile and conflict affected and also most vulnerable to climate impacts. And just last week, USAID Administrator Samantha Power shared her vision for the agency with a strong emphasis on increasing local partnership and participation, providing direct support to partners on the ground, and making development more inclusive of marginalized groups. The draft climate strategy includes a special objective of strengthening operations and approaches to address climate and further climate justice within USAID and partner organizations. So where do you see opportunities for this kind of engagement within the Bureau for Conflict Prevention and Stabilization, and how are you working with your colleagues across the agency and finding opportunities to really engage with local partners on the ground?
Thanks, Lauren. I actually see our engagement in sort of three levels. That would be interagency, it would be host country, which would include the localization and on the ground, and then international or multilateral. So just to reinforce a couple of things on the interagency front, we do have USAID advisors, including humanitarian advisors and stabilization advisors in every single one of the COCOMs. So from there, we can, we learn a lot from DoD capacity to gather information, to analyze, and we can coordinate our strategies that way. We also have CivMil coordinators in every single US mission as well, and those feed up through the COCOMs. So there's a lot of coordination there already on and has been historically on stabilization generally, but now we overlay climate as part of that context. I wanted to agree with everything that Jen said on integrating climate into all of these different strategies. We have, and in CPS Bureau, we are the lead bureau on the Global Fragility Act strategy. We don't use fragility in the strategy itself. We don't use the word fragility because we want to engage our local partners in that. So like by removing the sort of pejorative use of the word fragility, we want to get more local ownership of the strategy going forward. So it's the strategy to prevent conflict and promote stabilization. And then we're also the lead within USAID on the Women, Peace and Security strategy. And I wanted to particularly give a shout out to that one because in most of the documents I've seen so far, except for the USAID climate strategy, I don't see a lot of influence on gender. And we know two things. We know that women will be disproportionately impacted by things like migration, by things like scarcity of water resources, all of the things that may exacerbate climate and violence as climate change affects more and more countries. And so we really want to make sure that we strengthen the role of women, both in participation in political processes, but also protection, as women tend to be more vulnerable. So that's another strategy that we're sort of moving front and forward on the climate front. And then, our localization effort is just perfect for this because, as I mentioned, we think of climate security as human security. And in the countries where we work, one of the things that we really, with the localization, what we're trying to do is be really leaning in on building civil society and the voice of the people in a lot of the countries where we work. And we want to empower those people. And just an anecdotal thing, and when I was the mission director in Burma, this is something that happened long before I arrived in country. But in around 2011, before the first democratic election, there was a huge Chinese dam that was starting under construction, the Midzone Dam, and actually that was halted by the former military government, partly because civil society activists were so effective in gaining popular support against that dam that they halted construction. They punted to the next government. We don't know what, to this day, we still don't know what will happen with that construction. But it demonstrated to me, and I think it was the only example, I'm not 100% sure of this, in the world of actually civil society mobilization stopping a Chinese infrastructure project. And those are the kind of things that I think we can build on with our engagement with local organizations and strengthening those organizations. So that's another thing. And just, as we talk about climate justice a lot, and I think a lot of times we think of that as the sense that the global north is responsible for the most emissions and the global south is suffering the most consequences. But we also think of climate justice or equity at the local level and how we want to make sure that mitigation efforts do not adversely affect or disproportionately affect marginalized populations, indigenous populations, and women and girls. So all of that those are the two parts of the coordination. And then international and multilateral cooperation. We know that while one agency cannot do it alone for the US government, one country cannot do it alone for the world. And I'm really encouraged by what we've seen coming out of COP26 on international cooperation and how we will work with especially other large donors on how we address this in the countries where we work. Thanks.
Thanks, Teresa. That really is very sort of reflective of some work that we've done at the Wilson Center on improving predictive capabilities for security risks posed by climate change. And one of the things that has come out of that work is the importance of working across the scales of decision making and incorporating everything from the local on up to the multilateral and international, not just to get the risk analysis right and to really understand what the impacts are going to be on the ground, but also where there are entry points for more effective responses and ensuring that the climate responses we put into place aren't going to unintentionally create other issues or exacerbate conflict. You also mentioned gender, which is another favorite topic of the Wilson Center and ECSP. And this sort of ties into another question that I have about how non-climate focused strategies coming out of the administration are going to integrate climate considerations. So you mentioned the Women, Peace, and Security agenda. The gender strategy that was released the same week as the suite of climate security products had climate all the way throughout, and including, I think there was a special objective or priority in the strategy to ensure that gender equity considerations are promoted in climate responses. The Global Fragility Strategy is another one that you mentioned, and seems like another opportunity to more intentionally integrate climate considerations when the strategy was released at the end of the Trump administration, there was consideration of environmental issues in it, but not climate per se. So actually, I think if Jennifer, I'd like to go back to you and ask how the administration is taking climate into consideration in the development of these non-climate focused strategies.
So, I mean, you've already provided a few examples, Lauren, but I would say, you know, as these strategies are under development, climate is at the table, and you'll see climate kind of infused throughout. The administration released the interim national security strategic guidance early on. I think it was mid-March. If you have read that, you will see climate is throughout that interim guidance, and that kind of same approach, you know, will be taken as the strategy itself is developed. But, you know, so historically we saw climate in a silo, right? Climate had its own section, but we didn't look at how climate was impacting all of these other things. So, you know, you saw this in the gender strategy. So again, as these larger strategies are being developed, and I won't speak for my DoD colleagues, but the National Defense Strategy, you know, and other kind of key strategic documents, and it's in Executive Order 14008, that the DoD climate risk analysis will be used to inform development of the National Defense Strategy and others. So the approach the administration is taking, you know, for strategies that are being developed from here at the White House, but also the guidance that has been given to departments and agencies, is that we will look at climate throughout everything. I think Kim mentioned earlier, DoD's climate adaptation plan. For those that have been tracking, every department and agency was tasked with developing a climate adaptation plan, and those were rolled out, I believe, the second week of October. So again, really looking at, even from how we do our work internal to our own departments and agencies, how we are actually taking climate into consideration there. So I would say it's kind of through all different levels. The government is actually incorporating climate, and again, not siloing it off, but really looking at how we do our work as the U.S. government through a climate lens. So it's really becoming pervasive throughout everything that we're doing.
Great, thank you, Jennifer. Sorry, I'm looking at some of the questions that are coming in to see how I might integrate them. I think, and actually, Kim and Reba, if you wanted to jump in on that, you're welcome to, but I have another question for you. So when you answer this one, you can build in a response to the other.
Very quickly,
sure.
For the NDS, we are taking climate and making sure it's cross-cutting. It's not going to be a standalone issue because it really touches upon everything the department has to do.
And, you know, and that'll drive the NMS and then our all of our theater planning as well. So that's our North Star for how we do all of our plans. So just one other piece, because there was such a great thread that Teresa had where she mentioned Women, Peace, and Security, the Global Fragility Act, climate change actions. I would throw in Summit for Democracy as well in there, kind of a confluence of events with this administration. I talked earlier about what do our partners need and how do we then kind of adjust the dials on these various lines of effort. I'm appreciative of the administration for kind of pulling that all together. I know that more work is being done on that, but that truly, you know, that confluence of all of these different silos that were kind of independent actions now coming together in a way because they are all interconnected. And I think this is the first time that we're approaching it from that way. And I'm really grateful to see that. Over.
Thank you. So sort of picking up on that, there has been some pushback on the idea that the DoD should be focusing on climate change at all, and that doing so distracts from more pressing threats like China. In a discussion with Sharon Burke at New America a couple of weeks ago, Undersecretary of Defense for Policy Colin Kahl spoke fairly forcefully on the issue, saying that China is the pacing challenge for the Department of Defense, but that the challenges posed by climate and China are actually intertwined, that how competitive the US or any country really, including China, can be will be in part determined by how prepared they are to roll with the climate punches, is how he put it. There's not a trade-off between investments in climate and staying laser focused on China as our pacing challenge. You both have significant portfolios with a number of pressing issues. Can you share with us how you are thinking about the balance of climate issues with these other critical areas?
Sure, I'm going to start if that's okay, Kim. Yeah, I think I opened this up earlier. This is the operational environment that we're going to have to deal with in the future. China is the pacing threat. It is the challenge. But I must be able to, provide more fighting capability in whatever environment we're in. We have to respond to, how industry is moving as well. If industry is shifting to, different vehicles, we're relying upon industry as we build out our force as well in many ways. So it doesn't change the fact of our focus. It changes how we prepare. And so I think that they're supporting lines of effort. I don't think they're competing lines of effort in any way. And with that, I'll turn it over to Kim if she has anything she wants to add.
I mean, just piggybacking on Reva's comments, and of course what Secretary USDP Call has said is that, not only are we looking at our capabilities, but we are part of a network, an alliance that a lot of our competitors don't have. So that increases our ability to look at resilience and look at how we generate power. So I just wanted to add that thread in. Thank you.
Thank you, that's great. Jennifer, can you provide an update on the NSC's current efforts to elevate climate within the foreign policy and national security agendas? You have the, where are you focusing policy attention now, and in what ways are the NSC-led mechanisms like this Climate Security Working Group useful in supporting that interagency coordination and progress? I mean, and if you're willing, like even where there are sort of challenges and sort of working out kinks to that process.
There are no kinks, Lauren, of course. I think we are, you just mentioned the Climate Security Working Group. We are in the process of getting that group kind of relaunched in the coming weeks. It will be a really great, I think, venue through which we can work together across the interagency on these very, really critical issues, but through a different type of approach, and not necessarily having to have every department and agency together looking at every issue, but being more strategic and having specific conversations. You'll note, as an example, looking at the climate and migration report, at the end, we talked about standing up an interagency process. We're going to use the Climate Security Working Group to have those conversations. There is a lot that we need to look into that was recommended in that report. So we'll use that group strategically to start talking through, some of those questions and some of those issues. I think we are bringing together departments and agencies that haven't typically, one, worked on these issues, but two, haven't necessarily worked together on these issues. And so I think, the processes that, have been underway for the, development of the climate and migration report really started to bring together these different groupings of departments and agencies, and even different elements within those different agencies that might not have necessarily worked together previously. So there's obviously growing pains with that too, kind of figuring out how to work, not how to work together, but kind of what each different elements kind of roles and responsibilities are kind of within these very, these are very complex issues. And there is so much to do. I think we've really talked about that a lot today. There is just so much that we need to kind of address from a U.S. government perspective, but our engagement with, countries globally that, being able to work together and really bring together our strengths from across the USG is really critical. And so being able to use groups like the Climate Security Working Group to really leverage the whole of government in bringing kind of our best kind of elements to address each challenge. So.
Thanks, Jennifer. When we talk about climate security, there's often a tendency to focus on the integration of climate into the security agenda. But as we all know, there needs to be an equal focus on integrating conflict and fragility and instability considerations into the climate agenda. And Teresa, you touched on this earlier. I wonder if you could talk about where you see opportunities to more meaningfully connect sort of these two aspects of the conversation.
Thanks for that question. It's a good one, because while climate change is, we look at it mostly as a threat, it does actually provide an opportunity for us. We, in most of the countries that are at risk or are most vulnerable to climate change, our interactions with the host governments in those countries, it gives us something. I mean, those governments and the people of those countries, they understand it as a risk already. And some of them are already seeing the effects of it. And even in countries where we have a hard time finding common ground to actually work together on something, this is a hook that gives us that common ground. And I think, although our State Department colleagues aren't with us today, like I think that that opportunity to use it on the diplomatic front as well, while we're making our development and our conflict risk mitigation interventions, it really does help us to create a better bond, I think, with those countries and to work more closely with those governments. I think the people we already have a good relationship with. We've talked about a couple of different risks, and I think that I've sort of lost the thread of your question, I think, but I think as we look at conflict risk specifically, I think keeping in mind that we have to do really good analysis in order to have a good early warning system on when climate will affect conflict specifically. Looking at constantly looking at impact on vulnerable populations, as I said, on women and girls. And then working with our missions on the ground and our country teams on the ground to make sure that that everyone has a climate lens and a conflict lens on all of the interactions that they have with local organizations, with governments, and into the actual programs that we're financing and funding. And I think it's really important to look at this as we, as part of our climate security, we're supposed to be mobilizing $150 billion of climate finance. So as we look at climate finance, we need to make sure that the projects that are financed, whether it be clean energy, whether it be mitigation through forestry, whatever, that we look at making sure that the benefits, the jobs and the benefits that that come from that financing accrue to traditionally marginalized populations and to women as well.
Those are great points. Thank you, Teresa. Reba and Kim, what about for you? How do you see, or where do you see opportunities to ensure that conflict considerations are integrated into climate change actions in response?
Thank you for that question. And it's really important from a policy and strategy perspective how closely we need to work with our state and USAID counterparts, because if we are doing conflict sensitive climate interventions, we need to be aware of where there are potential community fault lines. So what may be seen as an innocuous act regarding water scarcity could actually exacerbate already existing tensions. So that's a top line thought I have as we work with our other policy offices that work closely with USAID.
Okay, covered it. We're good.
All right.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you all bring a lot of expertise to that, right? And so this interagency coordination allows for you to sort of help shape those approaches in a more effective way, which I think is the whole goal. Sherry chatted me a question here. What climate security disruptions keep you up at night? How is your agency using modeling and simulation and exercises to explore these climate risks? Kind of a personal question. What keeps you up at night? Jennifer, go ahead.
So I'm not going to start with what keeps me up at night. But what I would say is that I think we are seeing, to your point about exercising or exercises, I think what's been really interesting to see over the last couple of months is seeing climate integrated into exercises by agencies that have not typically done so. So I've been working with FEMA's exercise team in coordination with our Resilience and Response Directorate here at the NSC, and integrating climate into exercises on hurricanes, as well as other types of potential events. And so it's been really interesting because the community, the response community, has not necessarily really thought about climate in that context. So it's been, from my perspective, really heartening to see the kind of awareness growing that climate needs to start being kind of integrated into kind of more of these things. And so now I'll answer, I think, what keeps me up at night. And I don't know that it keeps me up at night necessarily, but, you know, I think there were, and there have been historically, still are, you know, a lot of different constituencies that have not necessarily recognized the impacts that climate change is already having and will increasingly have on our lives and livelihoods. And so, you know, there is a long way to go still, but I think that we are seeing, even just over the last 6 to 9 months, a growing awareness across some very key constituencies, not just at the government level, but within, you know, civil society and otherwise, even in some of our, you know, larger international organizations, really recognizing climate change and starting to think about climate change in the context of, you know, their core missions as well.
Thank you, Jennifer. Teresa?
Thanks. So I think for us, I'm not sure we would really call it modeling as much as we definitely are dependent on our interagency and on other departments for a lot of the more cost-intensive actual climate analysis and forecasting that happens. But we look really at the context and analyzing the context. A lot of our work, you know, really involves how we engage human beings, and that's just constant interaction. It's investing in civil society, investing in good governance. We look at political economies in the countries where we work, or political economy analyses. We try to look at conflict forecasting, but a lot of that is through exchange with organizations and people. So on the big dollar things, we really rely on our Department of Defense colleagues for the modeling and analysis. And these reports are super helpful. The migration report, USAID played a big part in that particular report. And we see it as very valuable, because I think that's a big, for our work in the field, and especially on the response end that Jen alluded to. That's important for us. And I think we just continue to engage in this, in these type of dialogues and participate where we can. We've been really fortunate to be engaged in some of the exercises that DoD has done in different places. And that's very helpful for us. And I think we can make a good contribution to those type of exercises as well. Thanks.
Thank you, Teresa. I think I'll go to a few questions from the audience. Oh, sorry, go ahead. Yep.
I'm sorry, before you roll off of that, if you don't mind, just from the Joint Force perspective, and I know we spent, yeah, we just spent a lot of time talking about exercises and wargaming, and obviously we already talked about the NDS and the NMS and how that all drives into what ultimately becomes the exercises that we develop to get after those priorities, and obviously climate change now being incorporated in there. Appreciate Teresa's remarks on the NorthCom exercises on response to protecting the homeland, and just to pull that thread a little bit on there, why we're so passionate about making this a whole of government discussion is the resources required to support those activities. Where it is a huge lift for the Department of Defense whenever something like that happens, and obviously, happy to provide that capability in so many ways. But the more we can make this a whole of government response, the less it puts a demand on the Joint Force, which then enables us to be ready to your previous question, engage in the fight with our adversaries, right? And so we do have the capabilities within the homeland to be resilient in this space and to respond to this space. DoD does provide, planning and rapid response capabilities, but the more we can, ensure that we're capable of doing that outside of DoD, the better our resources are used for what they were actually purchased for. So, for us, the more we do those exercises and show where some of those gaps and seams are and where there's a reliance on DoD, where there might not necessarily should be a reliance on DoD, the better, and then help bolster up everyone else's resilience in that space. Kim, did you have anything you wanted to add on that?
I think those are really important points. And what's we highlight in the DCRA is the importance of using the best available science and data. So I think this all feeds into how we are looking deliberately at making sure we're thoughtful and integrated across the board. Thank you.
So and we could pull this thread into kind of the COVID response piece too, on where we did step into that space, and now in the aftermath of it, we're looking and going, okay, where should we fund appropriately for the future pandemic preparedness? What agencies should be bolstered so that we don't require kind of pulling in DoD in that space, understanding that there's a cost when you do that. So thank you for listening. I just want to kind of give the Joint Force impacts on something like that.
I'm glad you did. Those were really excellent points, and thinking about sort of how you build systems resilience across the agencies, and COVID being a really good example for why that's needed and where there were gaps, and how people have been working sort of around the clock over the last year and a half to address those gaps. You spoke about resources. So there's a couple questions about sort of getting at resources and how to keep sort of them sustained, and make sure that the actions sort of put into place under the Biden administration are able to be sustained after the administration and into the next. One question is from Swati Viravalli at AFRICOM. She asks, if we are to leverage the geographic combatant commands doing more on climate security, especially with regard to security cooperation, how is this possible without sustained funding for these types of engagements and activities? Another question from Juliana Pape, I'm sorry, Juliana. What is happening to make sure that these strategies and focuses on climate, gender, et cetera, will be permanent and not changed by the administration? Part of this is about funding and resources and making sure that these efforts are resourced, but it's also about putting into place sort of policies and programs that are more permanent. So I wonder who would like to take that question. There's the specific one on the combatant commands. So Reba and Kim, maybe we can pass it to you first.
I think, everything kicks off with the NDS. I mean, that is the North Star for how the department is going to be looking, prioritizing, and that then seeps down to other important planning and guidance documents. We do know that, and Deputy Secretary Hicks has addressed how the services are looking at this. So I think there's a whole of department focus on the climate considerations in order to make sure that we are best positioned to do our job no matter where in the world. So that's my top line.
No, that's perfect, Kim. I think there's perhaps a bit of a misperception that that we haven't been focused on this. If you look at why were we so able to quickly produce a fulsome document with the DCRA, with the climate adaptation plan, it's because this is already baked into what we're doing in DoD and within the Joint Force. And back to my opening round of I need to be prepared to fight in any environment, right? So whether it's that, whether it's in the JROC process, multiple places where this has been a focus for DoD over the long term, going back at least 10 years in the documentation that I've been looking at recently. So, I don't think this is just, an effort of now. I think it's been a long-standing effort that is now energized and accelerated as it should be. But I think it's already pretty baked into many of our documents. So I don't think you're going to, feel the kind of up and down of it right now. We're just on a acceleration upward. Thanks.
Thank you. I'm watching the clock. There's a lot of good questions. I think I'm going to ask this one that just came in because it speaks back to the sort of the importance of science and data. And we don't have anybody from any of the USG science agencies on the panel today, but obviously they play a very critical role in all of this. So the question from Travis Pitts he's a climate security lead at the Los Alamos National Laboratory. How are the DoD, USAID, the NSC, and other agencies like FEMA currently leveraging or planning to leverage the latest state-of-the-art climate science and modeling? Jennifer?
Thanks, Lauren. And it's a great question. And I can just say, for the development of the report on the impacts of climate change on migration, the federal science agencies were key partners and absolutely critical to putting that report together, especially that first chapter that really looks at, sort of the first section that looks at the kind of geopolitical implications of climate change. And so they were core contributors. I know that they were also kind of key partners to the intelligence community. They provided the science and the analysis in support of the NIE. They supported the development of the DCRA as well. And so, I think kind of going back, this administration has really kind of leaned into and has been very vocal about evidence-based decision-making, really informed decision-making based on the best available science, the best available data. The work that we are doing in the climate security space from here at the NSC, we are ensuring that our federal science agencies are at the table and part of these conversations. So that's just from here at the NSC, from the NSC perspective.
Thank you, Jennifer. Teresa, Kim, or Reva, would you like to chime in on that?
Sure, I can.
Yeah, Teresa, go
just, on the resource question, I come from an agency that throughout our history has been asked to do more and more with less and less resources. And so we're very accustomed to that. As we saw the prior changes of administration that we recently went through, and we saw climate sort of being de-emphasized, and then now we come back and we're asked to elevate it again, which we never stopped thinking about it in USAID. As Reva mentioned, I think those of us that have knowledge of it never really stopped focusing on it. But yet we haven't seen a huge influx of resources yet, not that are within our agency for us to program. But I think that one of the best ways that we can continue sustained effort on climate, and particularly for us on climate and conflict, is to actually be able to demonstrate impact. And I think that's where our whole monitoring and evaluation system has to come in. If we can actually demonstrate a positive impact from the work that we're doing, whether it be on, and particularly to be able to relate that to US national security. Sometimes those of us in the development world, we see the impact of what we're doing on the ground, but we always have to relate that to US national security. And to the extent we can do that, I think we will be able to see sustained attention and resources on the subject.
Great point. Thank you, Teresa.
From a policy perspective, knowing the resources we have throughout DoD and the PhDs that are looking at climate policy, our counterparts in ANS that have science and engineering backgrounds, that all have connections to the laboratories we have through the federal government. There are also informal communities that have been looking at climate and climate security that we've been able to leverage through the recess group. So I think the focus and the importance.
Do you want to explain what the recess group is for those watching who might not know?
I'm going to call over to a policy colleague that actually stood it up.
Great, Annalise.
Annalise, Dr. Bloom.
Surprise appearing. Hi, thanks so much. Resource competition, environmental security and stability, and we're a 200+ person community in the DoD and other agencies. Really happy to have participation from USAID, the State Department, science agencies, to bring these issues into DoD, bring science experts from the national labs in to come talk with us, as well as share information and make sure that we're leveraging the best science and making decisions and policy informed by that science. So thanks.
It's the first time I've seen Annalise's face in like 4 months. So she has a good smile.
So that is how we are making sure it's integrated across the board.
It seems like their stream just froze for a minute. So we'll go back to them when they come back on. Teresa, I have a question that I think might be a good one for you. This is our environment, social governance credentials for private corporations likely to forward sustainability of social justice. I think USAID does a lot with the private sector and has been very successful in sort of leveraging across public-private partnerships. Can you speak a little bit about the ESG approach?
Sure, I can. And I guess when I said no one country can do it alone, I probably should have added that the public sector alone can't do it. We will rely on private sector investment to move a lot of these climate responses and climate investment forward in a good way. I think over the years, US companies have become much better than they were on issues of social responsibility, and we can't always guarantee what companies and other countries will do. But one of the things that I've seen us do in USAID in the past is to build in to some of our programming, and especially where we are advising host governments, is to build in some of those requirements into local legislation and into the activism of local civil society organizations. And actually some countries where I've worked have standalone corporate social responsibility advisory groups that it isn't necessarily to impose or to resist private sector investment as much as to advise foreign investment or foreign companies coming in and making investments on what the local sensitivities might be, including how to do conflict sensitive investment to make sure that they understand the dynamics that are happening at the local level and able to ensure investment without adversely affecting social justice and climate justice.
Thank you, Teresa. I have one more question. Oh, actually, and Kim, we can come back to you. I'm sorry that you froze for just a second. But I'm going to throw in one more question to pass it to you, and then I'm going to have to wrap up and send it over to Sherry for some final thoughts. But this came through from Jackie Catalina Schaefer. In Alaska, 43% of all communities are threatened by climate change, yet we are the closest to our major international threats with, Can you, I'm sorry, can you hear me, Teresa and Jennifer? I just got a note. Okay, are we okay? Okay, so I'm gonna start back at the start of the question for Kim and Reba. In Alaska, 43% of all communities are threatened by climate change, yet we are the closest to our major international threats. With the Arctic warming at more than twice as fast as the rest of the planet, how will the US create a safe Arctic for the Arctic Americans living in the region? So I've given your portfolio. I thought I'd pass it back to you, and I'm sorry that you froze earlier after the recess point, but if you want to finalize that point too, you're welcome to.
Sure. Going to the comment about the Arctic, and that is the region where we're seeing the fastest impacts of global warming, and we're watching that very closely. We understand how it is a geopolitical interest there. There are resources that are important there. We know competitors are there. We have Russia, that is an Arctic nation. We have China, that's a near Arctic nation that's interested in the region. So it's something that DoD is involved in. We have a new DoD regional center focused on Arctic security. So we're appreciative of that and the links that brings to the science communities, working, of course, with our NATO allies that have interests in the region. So it's a focus, and we remain poised.
So yeah, just to pull a little bit further on that, obviously awaiting the NDS and the NMS will be informed off of that as well, and expecting the Arctic thread to be pretty strong in that space. And then the expectation that we'll do an Arctic strategy review on the backside of that to ensure that we're looking at this global problem set and incorporating it into all the command planning. I think we're all very aware that this needs our focus. I think we're frozen again as well.
No, we can hear you. You're good. Thank you. I mean, I just, and Sherry can probably speak to this too, but Arctic actually provides a really important way of illustrating sort of climate change's cascading effects, right? I think Mike Sbrega, the recent director of the Polar Institute, he's now the chair of the Arctic Research Commission, talks often about how, what happens in the Arctic doesn't stay in the Arctic, and all this acceleration of climate impacts in the Arctic can be felt, in the Sahel, for example, and changing precipitation patterns. And so I think there's a growing awareness of that, obviously, as indicated by DoD's efforts in that space. I want to, before I pass it to Sherry, I just want to, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, just on that, not to go too liberal on this discussion, but it's an extremely harsh environment in the Arctic, and so yeah, the changes are accelerated. There is opportunity in that space as well. If you look at some of where adversaries have invested over the long term, and they're struggling with some of their infrastructure in that space. So as we move forward, it's a place to do smart investments, knowing that it is a rapidly changing environment. And I think we have an opportunity in this space going forward to set our posture for the long term in a very good and very strong way. Over.
Right, thank you. And then just the sort of importance of the Indigenous communities there, and ensuring that they're part of that decision making as well. I want to thank all of you for being with us today on behalf of the Wilson Center and the Center for Climate and Security. It's really been a pleasure and a privilege to host you, and thank you for your leadership in this space. It's incredibly important. Just for those watching, I think there were some glitches with the web stream at the beginning of the event, so no worries. The event is being recorded and will be available very soon in its full recording, and we'll have a summary to share on both the Center for Climate and Security's blog and the Wilson Center's new security beat. Sherry, over to you for some final words. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lauren. Very well moderated and great discussion. I think we really see today now what it means to apply a climate lens across the full range of security policy planning and analysis. So I'm just going to draw a couple of themes I heard from the discussion here. One is the integration of climate security into the whole stability and humanitarian affairs portfolio, which may seem obvious now in the way all of you have talked about it, but wasn't clear when, for example, the Conflict and Stabilization Office, CSO, let's say its state was created 15 years ago. That was all about, post-Afghanistan, Iraq conflict stabilization, but now it's really shifting both in defense, state, USAID, and across the interagency to integrate sort of the climate lens, the Global Fragility Act, other lenses that are so important. Second, this integration, another theme has been the integration of science and security, the science agencies with the security agencies. A tip of the hat here to Annalise, both who helped jumpstart this event, but also as a AAAS fellow herself, is a scientist leading in the security space, having formed the Recess Group. The US GCRP Advisory Committee, on which I serve, is all about, in some ways, integrating this and supporting the work of the Climate Security Working Group and others. And I see much more this creating the new muscle memory, as Jen very well talked about, is partly doing that in the science and security agencies working together on carbon problems that have real world needs right away. Third, Brigadier General Sunkist represents this so well, the warfighter working with the policymaker and the budgeteers. The J5 where Brigadier General Sunkist is a new home for climate work, but working with OSD policy. You've got the J4 working with acquisition and and sustainment, the J2, the intelligence working with OSD intelligence, and we could go down the list, but it represents how that climate lens is being integrated throughout the defense security community. Then this whole thing, prevention, preparedness, and not just consequence management. The left of boom that many of you mentioned, getting ahead of the curve, getting prepared, because we increasingly are responding to natural disasters here at home with our military assets, and we need to be able to help ensure we can properly prepare and respond and also face the adversary. The climate and conflict lens, increasingly important, the pacing threat of China, but the shaping threat of climate change, as you've all talked about. Aaron and I have written some on that as well, and USAID really being at the forefront of climate as a catalyst for conflict. And then for everybody, the climate literacy across every domain and building the next generation of climate literate professionals in our COCOMs, our regions, our embassies, and our USAID missions, which will enable us finally to climate proof our institutions, our infrastructure, our policies, and our practice. And then I'm going to close with what I thought was a very uplifting final note that Teresa observed, that climate is both a threat. Of course, I've been saying threat multiplier for a long time, but it's an opportunity as well, an opportunity to build those partnerships for greater resilience, and also to incorporate the important considerations of climate justice, equity, raising all boats, and hopefully for a more prosperous future for all and for all our children. So thank you all very much for joining us here today at the Wilson Center and the Center for Climate and Security. We're very pleased to have you, and thank you. Wish you all a good weekend.